It was small, too small, an emaciated, immobile form, blending seamlessly with the junk that litters the street. It went past people without a glance. They didn't stop, didn't care, but Daniel did. And at that time, he didn't know how much this one decision would alter the course of his life forever. The discovery. Daniel had always been the sort of guy who minded his own business. It wasn't that he didn't care, he just minded his own business. He was used to minding his own business and staying out of things that weren't his problem. But today was different. He had been trudging home from work, sunlight-drenched, head buzzing with a million different thoughtful things, bills, deadlines, life. And then he saw it. At first, his brain could not even comprehend what he was seeing. Just a mangled form on the pavement, a few old newspapers, some plastic bags. But then, it moved. A little vibration, so faint it's hard to even notice. Daniel stopped cold. Something startled his heart in the prison of his chest. That wasn't trash. That was a dog, a tiny Chihuahua. And he was hanging on by a thread. A fight for survival. Daniel dropped to his knees. The dog didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't even seem to register him being there. His fur was filthy and matted and soaked from the damp pavement. His ribs were pushing against his frail skin as though he had not eaten in days or weeks. And worst of all, his breathing was shallow, too shallow. Daniel paused, his hands suspended over the small body. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, "can you hear me?" Nothing, no response. Daniel's stomach settled into a cold dread. The Chihuahua was so tiny, so fragile, he seemed half a dream, like a shadow of a dog, not a real, live animal. Daniel's hands shook as he carefully picked him up. He was weightless, like holding a ghost, and at that moment, Daniel knew, without intervention, this dog wasn't going to live. The race against time. Daniel didn't think, didn't hesitate, even didn't care that he had no clue what he was doing. He just ran. His car was parked 2 blocks away, and by the time he got to it, his heart was pounding. He opened the passenger door, carefully spread his jacket inside, and placed the Chihuahua on it. "Just hold on," he mumbled, scrambling for his keys. "Stay with me, little guy." The dog didn't move, didn't make a sound, didn't even open his eyes. Daniel clenched his jaw. His gut was screaming at him. Something wasn't right. This wasn't some well-fortified stray dog who hadn't eaten for a couple of days. Something else was wrong, something worse. And Daniel was about to learn what exactly. The moment everything changed, as the second Daniel burst in through the vet's doors, the receptionist's eyes went wide. She glanced at the Chihuahua, her face blanched. "We need a doctor now," she yelled back over her shoulder. Daniel's stomach dropped. He had expected concern, he had expected urgency, but this was something else, something worse. A vet tech appeared within seconds, calmly taking the dog from Daniel's arms and rushing him into the back. Daniel had little time to respond. He simply stood there, stunned, as the doors swung closed. The receptionist looked back at him. Her face was still worried. "Where did you find him?" she asked. Daniel swallowed. "On the street," he said. "Why? What's wrong with him?" The receptionist hesitated. Then, in a lowered voice, she whispered, "Because we've done this before." Daniel's blood ran cold. She wasn't referring to a stray. She was referring to something else, something much more unsettling. And right then, at that point, Daniel understood he had just stepped into a mystery larger than he could ever have imagined. The receptionist's voice was just above a whisper, but for Daniel, it was thunder. He froze, his mind whirling. What did she mean? What had they seen before? Before he could ask, the doorways to the exam room slammed open. A middle-aged veterinarian in a white coat splattered from years of hard labor burst out. He had a sharp feel to him, urgent. His eyes locked onto Daniel. "You mentioned you found this dog on the street?" His voice was clipped, tense. Daniel nodded slowly. Yeah, he was barely breathing. "What's wrong with him?" The vet let out a puff through his nose. Then after a long pause, he waved for Daniel to follow. "Come with me." And it was just like that. Daniel knew. This wasn't just a stray dog. This was a whole other thing. The exam room reveal. The cramped, sterile exam room smelled of antiseptic and something else, something metallic. Blood. The Chihuahua was lying on the table connected to an IV, his tiny body rising and falling with shallow breaths. But now, Daniel could see something he hadn't seen before. Around the dog's neck and legs, the fur was shaved away, exposing strange circular scars, not scratches, not bruises, perfect circles. Daniel's stomach tightened. The vet pointed to the marks. These are not street injury types. These were done to him. Daniel's breath hitched. Done to him? By who? The vet didn't answer. Instead, he looked at the nurse who was at the counter. "Go ahead and run the scan," he said. The nurse nodded and picked up a microchip scanner. Daniel frowned. "You think he has an owner?" The vet's face hardened. "I think that's worse than that." The scanner beeped. The nurse's eyes widened. She rotated the screen to face the vet, and in that instant, Daniel watched as the vet's face transformed. Not in relief, not in surprise, in fear. The vet took a step back and muttered to himself. Daniel leaned in, and what he saw on the screen chilled him to his blood. The ID number wasn't normal. It was government-issued. The code that shouldn't exist. "This doesn't make sense," the nurse said, her hands shaking. Daniel stared at the screen. The microchip number wasn't a standard 9 or 10 digits, and so it was a 20-character code. And the name of an owner had been replaced by a single word. Restricted. Daniel's skin prickled. "What the hell does that mean?" he asked. The vet didn't answer. As he was already groping for the phone, he dialed with fingers that trembled. His voice was low the moment the call connected. Controlled. "Yeah, it's me. We've got another one." Daniel's pulse spiked. "Another one?" he repeated. "What do you mean, another one? Who are you calling?" The vet closed the line without responding. Finally, after a beat, he turned back to Daniel, and the way he looked at him sent a shiver down his spine. "You have to go," the vet said. Daniel caught his breath in his throat. "What? Why?" The vet clenched his jaw, because if they know you found him, they'll come for you next. The threat becomes real. Daniel's blood turned to ice. "Who?" he demanded. The vet hesitated, and that was when Daniel saw it. The nurse. She was shaking. She looked out toward the front window, almost as if she was waiting for something. Daniel followed her gaze, and his stomach dropped. Outside, parked just past the streetlight, was a black SUV. The engine was still running. The windows were darkly tinted, and Daniel had a horrible suspicion that whoever was inside wasn't there to adopt a Chihuahua. The vet lowered his voice. "You have to go now." Daniel's heart pounded. "What are you not telling me?" The vet swallowed hard. Then he murmured, "That dog isn't just a stray. He was part of something." Daniel's pulse spiked. "Part of what?" The vet didn't answer, because just before he could, the SUV door opened, and Daniel realized he was already out of time. Daniel could hear his heart pounding in his ears. The vet's warning echoed in his mind, but it was too late. The SUV door opened. A man stepped out. dressed in all black, no logo, no identification, and the way he moved, slow, calculated, like he was already aware of how this would conclude. A threat in the dark. Daniel's gut told him to flee, to snatch up the dog and get the hell out. But before he could leave, the vet grabbed his arm. "If you run, they will follow," he hissed. Daniel's breath hitched. "Who are they?" The vet didn't answer, because the man in black was already there. The air in the room shifted. The nurse retreated a little, her fingers tightening around a clipboard, as if it were armor all of a sudden. The man did not respond to her, never even looked at the Chihuahua lying on the table. His glacial, penetrating gaze fell squarely on Daniel. "Mr. Carter," he said. Daniel's stomach dropped. "How do you know my name?" The faintest trace of a smile curled on the man's lips. "You've gotten a hold of something that doesn't belong to you." His voice was calm, unbothered, as if it had been a mistake that needed fixing, like Daniel stopping to pick up a dying dog from a city street. Daniel swallowed hard. "It was just a stray," he said. I didn't." The man held up a hand. "No need to explain. Just hand over the dog, and this will all be over." The impossible decision. Daniel turned to look at the Chihuahua, still unconscious, still barely breathing. But something deep inside told him, if he gave the dog up, he'd never see him again. And not because he was soon to be adopted, because then he wouldn't exist anymore. Daniel's fists clenched. "He needs help." The man sighed, like he had expected this. "You don't know, Mr. Carter." His voice was almost bored. "That thing isn't a pet. It's an experiment." Daniel's blood ran cold. The vet tensed beside him. The nurse gasped softly, and suddenly Daniel knew. The scars, the government microchip, the circular marks. This was a dog who had felt something unnatural, and whoever these men were, they wanted him back. An irreversible mistake. "I'm not giving him to you." Daniel couldn't stop the words from leaving his mouth. The man's face didn't budge. No anger, no frustration, just a slow, bemused shake of his head. "That's disappointing." He stepped forward, and that's when Daniel noticed it, the gun strapped to his belt. Not police-issued, not military. Something else. Something unregistered. Daniel's heart pounded against his ribs. The vet grabbed his wrist. "Daniel," he whispered, "let them take him. You don't know what you're signing up for." Daniel shook his head. No. It was something inside him screaming. Every instinct, every fiber of his being was saying, this dog was in danger. And now, so was he. The escape. Daniel acted before he had time to think. He jerked the Chihuahua off the table, cradling its tiny body against his chest. The man in black's face grew dark. "Well, that's a bad choice, Mr. Carter." Daniel's heart pounded. He didn't wait, didn't breathe, he just ran. The door swung open as he ran into the night. The cold air slapped against his face, but he didn't stop. He heard footsteps behind him, more than one. The vet's voice rang out from inside, yelling. But Daniel didn't turn back. The Chihuahua was limp in his arms, still barely alive. And Daniel knew, if he paused, even for a moment, neither of them would survive this. The chase begins. The streets were dark, empty. Daniel felt his legs burning from the run, his breath coming in panicked gasps. Behind him, the engine of the SUV started up. Shadows moved across the pavement as headlights swept. Daniel turned a corner. His mind was racing. Where could he go? Who could he trust? And most importantly, what the hell had he just gotten himself into? Daniel ran. Cold air burned his lungs, but he didn't dare slow down. The Chihuahua in his arms hung limp, too light, too fragile. and behind him, the SUV's engine roared. The cranking of tires on pavement as it turned the corner too quickly, too ferociously. They hadn't simply followed him, they were hunting him. The streets turned against him. Daniel pounded down the sidewalk. His mind was racing. He needed to lose them. Fast. His eyes flicked to the alley in front of him. A narrow, dark cut between two old brick buildings. It wasn't optimal, but it was all he could do. His legs were on fire as he ran toward it. The tiny Chihuahua clutched to his chest. The SUV's headlights lit up the street behind him. They were gaining. Daniel felt his heart bang against his ribs. Just a little further. He got to the mouth of the alley, and then a second SUV emerged from the other end. Daniel came to an abrupt halt, chest heaving. His stomach dropped. They weren't chasing him. They were cornering him, trapped like an animal. Daniel's brain was shouting for an out. The Chihuahua's body remained limp, but his breathing was heartier now. He was still alive, still fighting. And so was Daniel. He spun, eyes raking the alley. There had to be another way out. A fire escape? A side door? Anything? Then he saw it. There was a rusty metal ladder that was bolted to the side of the building. It led to the rooftop. It was a risk, but he had no options. The SUV's door swung open. The same man in black emerged, calm, stoic. This is the only place left to go. Mr. Carter Daniel ignored him. He ran. The climb. He gripped the cold, rusted bars. The Chihuahua was curled beneath his arm, his tiny body still weak, but his eyes were open now. Daniel climbed, fast. The men below him suddenly broke into a run. "Stop!" Daniel didn't hesitate, didn't even think. He arrived on the rooftop as a gun firing followed. The bullet pinged off the metal bars. Daniel flinched but continued, rolling onto the rooftop, out of sight. He gasped for breath. His hands trembled. The Chihuahua stirred in his arms, but for the first time, Daniel sensed all was not well, because now close up, he could see the dog's eyes clearly, and they weren't normal. They were glowing. The truth starts to unravel. Daniel's breath hitched. What the hell? The Chihuahua blinked, and in that moment Daniel felt it. A pulse of something. Something electric. Something alive. The dog's body tensed. His ribs were not so prominent now. His skin didn't look as taut. It was like he was healing. Daniel's heart pounded. He had believed he was saving a dying stray. But now he wasn't so sure. And for the first time since this nightmare began, he understood. Perhaps they weren't pursuing him to harm the dog. Perhaps they were pursuing him to contain him. Nowhere left to run. A shout rang out from below. The men weren't giving up. Daniel crawled toward the edge of the rooftop, searching for an escape. Jumping to the next building was impossible. The streets below flooded with headlights. He tightened his grip around the Chihuahua. "What are you?" he whispered. The dog didn't answer, didn't bark, didn't make a sound. But his eyes locked with Daniel's, glowing, and for the first time, Daniel made it seem as if he was the one who was being watched. Daniel's whisper was soon off his lips, but the question lingered. The little Chihuahua was on his back in his arms, breathing stronger now, his luminescent eyes locked in on Daniel's, not in fear, not in confusion, in understanding, like he knew, like he'd been waiting for Daniel to solve it. And now there was no turning back. "They're still coming," a quick voice called from beneath. "Move up! He's on the roof!" Daniel's stomach dropped. He inched to the edge of the rooftop. 5 men were spreading out, 2 already scaling the fire escape. The SUV's engine revved. They were not going to let him slip away this time. And now, Daniel had nowhere else to run. The Chihuahua reacts. Daniel's breathing was rapid and shallow. Okay, think. The next building was too far to leap. The fire escape was the only way out. They were already coming up it. Trapped. But then, the Chihuahua moved. Daniel flinched. The dog convulsed in his arms, the whole body becoming suddenly tense, the small muscles rippling in a way that shouldn't have been possible. His eyes, that unnatural glow, brightened. And then Daniel felt it. A pulse. Not from the dog, from inside Daniel. Like a static shock, but more powerful, deeper. His heart skipped. What the hell? The Chihuahua faced the fire escape. Then he growled, a bark too deep for a little dog like that. Daniel's pulse spiked. Something was going to happen. He could feel it. And then it did. The energy that isn't supposed to be there. A low vibration was in the air. It began with a hum, low, just below the surface, an electrical current poised to break loose, and then, boom! A shock wave radiated from the body of the Chihuahua. It wasn't visible. It wasn't something Daniel could visualize. But he felt it. A violent force, like an unseen gust of wind pushing him backward, but not touching him. Instead, the men on the fire escape shouted. Daniel had little time to respond before he heard the metal groan. He turned his head to glimpse the men thrown back, like they had been struck by an unseen wave. Their bodies crashed into the building's wall. One of them lost his grip. Daniel watched in horror as he went down, all the way down. A sickening thud resonated beneath us. Silence. Then, shouting. The other men ran, but they weren't chasing Daniel now. They were retreating. Like they had observed something they weren't meant to see. Daniel's chest heaved and gasped in rapid, irregular breaths. The Chihuahua, free in his arms, was utterly calm. His breathing normal, his glowing eyes fading, as if nothing ever happened. What just happened? Daniel's hands were shaking. "What was that?" he whispered. The Chihuahua didn't answer, didn't react. But Daniel knew. This wasn't some random stray. This dog, this tiny, fragile-looking Chihuahua, was different. Something that was not supposed to be. And those men, they knew it. They had set out to hunt him down, not to kill him, but to control him. And now they were afraid. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Okay," he muttered. "Fine. You want to be mysterious? Cool. But if I'm putting my life on the line for you, I need answers." He gazed into the strange, inscrutable gaze of the Chihuahua. "Who are you?" The Chihuahua blinked, and then he wagged his tail. Daniel laughed nervously. Great. Just great. He didn't have a clue what he had just signed up for. But one thing was for sure. This was only the beginning. It hit Daniel like a freight train. Everything made sense now. The secret government chip, the scars, the men in black, instead of reacting with aggression, had reacted in fear. This wasn't about a lost dog. It was about something much larger. And now, Daniel was caught right in the middle of it. The aftermath. The night was eerily silent. Now, all that was left on the rooftop were Daniel and the Chihuahua. The black-wearing men had pulled back after the shockwave. Something Daniel still didn't understand. One moment they had been pursuing him. The next, they looked at the dog, and they ran. Daniel's heart was still pounding. His hands shook as he held the Chihuahua close. "Okay," he said, his breathing still choppy. "Well, let's just work this out." The Chihuahua blinked up at him. Daniel sighed. "First question, what the hell did you just do?" The dog didn't answer, didn't bark, didn't even move. But there was something in his overly intelligent eyes that sent a shiver through Daniel, like he understood, like he was waiting. And then Daniel felt it, that same pulse of energy, but this time it was coming from inside of him. Something is wrong. Daniel took a sharp intake of breath. His chest tightened. His heartbeat felt off. Too strong, too loud. That feeling crept inside his skin, like static electricity firing in his bloodstream. "No, no, no," he said, clutching his arms. "What the hell is this?" The Chihuahua cocked his head. Then his bright eyes danced, and Daniel realized he had felt this before. Back at the vet's office, the first time the dog opened his eyes, it hadn't been a coincidence at all. It had been the beginning of something that Daniel wasn't prepared for. The flashback. Suddenly, pain. A piercing, stabbing pressure behind his eyes. Daniel lurched forward, holding his head as the world whirled viciously. The rooftop flickered. The night sky twisted. And then, he wasn't there anymore. An apparent memory that is not his. Daniel gasped as his eyes went blurry. The rooftop was gone. Instead, he was elsewhere. A laboratory bright, sterile white walls, the hum of machines, the faraway beeping of monitors, and standing in front of him, rows of cages. Each one held a dog. Small, shivering bodies curled against cold steel bars, their eyes dull, lifeless. Daniel's stomach twisted. He wasn't meant to be here. This wasn't his memory. So whose was it? His breathing hitched, because suddenly he knew such was the memory of the Chihuahua. And what Daniel was seeing was only the beginning. The secret experiment. In the memory, footsteps echoed. Daniel turned. At the far end of the room, a man in a white lab coat stood with his back to us, talking to someone out of frame. Subjects 4 through 9 have already learned to adapt to the augmentation process. His voice was cold, clinical. But Subject 10, he's different. Daniel's chest tightened. He knew where this was going. He spun around, looking frantically, and there, at the end of the row, in the smallest cage, was him, the Chihuahua. Smaller than the others, weaker, but his eyes, they were already glowing. The moment he escaped. The scientist kept talking. "Well, if he keeps showing these anomalies, we'll have no choice but to—" The room shook. A wave of imperceptible energy passed through the air and made the lights flicker. Sparks flew from the monitors. The machines short-circuited. And then, the cage door blew open. Alarms blared, shouts rang out, and amid the chaos, the little Chihuahua ran. Daniel's pulse spiked. This was it. And this was how he had ended up on the streets. This was why the men in black had desired him back. And worst of all, this wasn't just about him. He wasn't the only one. The return to reality. Daniel gasped awake. The rooftop was back. The cold air stung his skin. His pulse thundered against his ribs. His Chihuahua sat in front of him, observing, waiting. Daniel staggered back. "That was you," he whispered. The dog blinked. Daniel swept a hand through his hair. "You're not just some stray." Compared with the reality of what he'd just witnessed, the words felt small. He was not merely working with a dog. He was dealing with a weapon that had escaped. And now, his makers wanted him back. Daniel exhaled sharply. "Okay," he muttered. "Hazard, guess we're together now." The Chihuahua perked its ears, and for the first time, he wagged his tail. Daniel's emphatic words rang in his ears. The little Chihuahua looked up at him, his tail wagging slightly, his glowing eyes glinting in the moonlight. It was supposed to look innocent, harmless, but now Daniel had learned the truth. This dog wasn't lost. He was running, and the people chasing him, they hadn't meant to hurt him. They were attempting to get in control of him. But the worst part, he wasn't the only one. The night isn't over. Daniel fought for his breath. He was still up on the rooftop, still trembling with the vision, the purloined memory. He shook as he dropped into a chair, trying to come to terms with everything he had just witnessed. Laboratory cages, dogs, no, test subjects, and at the end of the row, him, the Chihuahua. Daniel rubbed his face. "Okay," he muttered. "You were involved in some kind of experiment. You escaped. That's why they're coming for you." The Chihuahua cocked his head. Daniel exhaled. "But if you were subject 10, his stomach twisted. When did all the first 9 go?" The answer comes too fast. A rush of wind roared across the rooftop. Daniel wrapped his jacket more tightly around him. He needed a plan. He couldn't run in circles anymore. The men in black were still out there. "You are noted on data until October 2023. He needed to know what they were looking for. He needed to learn the origin of all this. And then the Chihuahua growled, low, warning. Daniel's pulse spiked. "What is it?" The dog's ears flattened. Then a shadow moved below. Daniel's breath hitched. He hedged off the roof on his belly and peered down, and his blood ran cold. The men in black were back, but this time they weren't alone. The second dog. Initially, Daniel thought a police K9 had come. A big black German shepherd stood next to them, muscles coiled, eyes on the building. His posture, so rigid, so precise, was too controlled, too unnatural. Then, there beneath the flickering streetlight, Daniel saw it. The dog's eyes. They glowed, just like the Chihuahua's. Daniel's heart skipped. Oh, hell no. This wasn't a police dog. This was another experiment, another subject. And now, they had found him. The command no one should ever have to hear. One of the men raised a hand. The German shepherd remained motionless. It didn't bark, didn't break eye contact. He was waiting. Daniel's hands balled into fists. "They're using him," he said, whispering. "He's one of them." Then, the man dressed in black said something, and it was too soft for Daniel to hear. But as soon as the words escaped his lips, the German shepherd jerked its head up, and then he jumped. "The attack begins." Daniel hardly had a chance to react. The dog was on the ground 1 second. The next, he was climbing the side of the building, not climbing, jumping, launching off the brick with unnatural agility. Daniel's stomach dropped. That's not normal. The Chihuahua barked sharply. Then he moved, fast, too fast. Daniel didn't even have time to blink before the small dog shot forward, off the rooftop. "What are you doing?" Daniel scrambled to the edge. His heart raced as he saw the Chihuahua collide with the shepherd in midair. A jolt slammed through the air. The German shepherd emitted a hurt snarl, and then both dogs fell to the pavement below. Daniel's chest tightened. This wasn't just a fight. This was something else. That he didn't get, you know? But he was about to. Because down below, the men in black were watching, not in fear, in expectation. Like this was just what they had been waiting for. And for the first time, Daniel wondered whether he had already lost. Daniel could see it now. The way the men in black were standing still, too calm, as if they weren't just watching a fight. They were studying it, measuring it. And that meant one thing. This had happened before. The crash, farther down, the 2 dogs hit the pavement. The German shepherd sprung to its feet, body taut as a spring, its glowing eyes fixed on its target. The Chihuahua didn't move. Daniel's breath caught. No. Then a flicker, not in the air, not in the city lights, in the Chihuahua himself. Like a glitch in the fabric of reality, his tiny form shimmered for half a second, and then he was just gone. Daniel's pulse spiked. Where did he go? Then, the shepherd spasmed violently. His head jerked sideways as if he'd been hit, but there was nothing there, at least not at first. Then the air rippled, and all of a sudden, the Chihuahua was right behind him. Daniel's chest tightened. He teleported. The impossible ability. The shepherd snarled. Daniel could tell he hadn't seen that coming. Neither had the men watching. For the first time, they seemed unsettled. One of them spoke into a radio. Daniel's stomach twisted. They didn't think he could do it, he said quietly, and now they had their answer. The counterattack, the shepherd moved first. His body blurred. 1 second he was standing, the next he was lunging, too fast, too precise. Daniel hardly had time to blink before the Chihuahua dodged, but not normally. One moment he was facing the shepherd, the next he was behind him again. No movement, no transition, just gone, then back. The shepherd rose, skidding to a stop, ears back. He was confused now, frustrated. The men in black muttered to one another. Daniel could feel it. They were calculating, and that meant they still believed they could win. The command that altered everything. One of the men moved toward the front. He didn't shout, didn't raise his voice. Instead, one single word came from his mouth. Daniel didn't hear it, but the shepherd did. And there he was. He was no longer holding back. His entire body tensed. The air around him shifted. And then his eyes turned white. Daniel's breath hitched. What the hell? The shepherd moved. And this time, the Chihuahua didn't move quickly enough. The blow that altered everything the shepherd struck first. Not a bite, not a tackle, something else, something that shouldn't even be possible. A wave of power emanated from his form, sending an apparent shock to the air. It smashed into the Chihuahua before he could blink it away, and then the small dog went down like a sack. Hard. Daniel froze. The Chihuahua emitted a piercing whine, tried to get up, and collapsed. Daniel's stomach dropped. No. The men in black exchanged nods, as if they all knew this would happen, as if they had been expecting it. Daniel realized too late. They had just proven a point. They were never trying to win Daniel's fists curled into tight knots. This wasn't about getting the Chihuahua. It wasn't necessarily about stopping him. It was about pushing boundaries. The men in black had left them alone. They'd not attempted to take him, because they had already won. They had discovered his Achilles heel, and now they wouldn't have to chase him anymore. They knew how to break him. Daniel's pulse pounded. This was never a fight. He immediately felt the tightness in his chest. Realization hit him like a freight train. This was a damn experiment. Nowhere left to run. The Chihuahua tried to move. Daniel didn't hesitate. He leaped from the rooftop and crashed heavily on the pavement. He felt pain all the way up his legs, but he pushed through it. He picked up the tiny dog in his arms, pushing his hand against his chest. There was still a heartbeat. Weak, but there. Daniel exhaled sharply. He had one chance, one moment to save them both. But before he could shift, the shepherd growled. Daniel looked up and stared straight into the shining white gaze of something not quite canine anymore. And in that moment, he knew. They weren't getting out of this for free. Daniel could feel it now. The battle had never been a fight to win. It had been about control. And now, the men in black had discovered the Chihuahua's kryptonite, meaning they were overplaying games. The moment, everything changed. Daniel pinched the Chihuahua's lifeless body tightly. His little chest was still moving up and down, barely. His glowing eyes blinked, the weakened version. The shepherd remained standing only a few feet away, muscles tensed, his white-hot gaze searing into the night. But what scared Daniel the most? He wasn't attacking. He was waiting, because the next step wasn't his to take. It was owned by the men in black, and Daniel could feel it. They were about to take a turn for the worse. The order you never, ever give. One of the men in black stepped forward. His face was unreadable. No anger, no urgency, just cold calculation. Then he spoke. Activate Protocol 12. Daniel's chest tightened. Whatever that meant, it was not good. Then the shepherd moved. The monster they created. When the order was given, the German shepherd became something else. His head swung up to the sky, a pulse, deep, low, and unnatural, rippling through the air. The streetlights flickered. Daniel's breath caught. What the hell? Then the shepherd made a noise that was not a bark. It wasn't a growl, it was a scream. A deep, guttural, inhuman sound that resonated in the asphalt under Daniel's feet. And then the shepherd began to change. The shift. His muscles bulged, not just expanding, but transforming. His claws lengthened, his fur darkened, and his eyes, they faded from glowing white to black. Daniel's pulse spiked. Oh, no, 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 no. This wasn't simply an augmented beast. This was something else, something that should not be at all. And now it was looking right at him. The first attack. Daniel moved on instinct. He turned, he ran, anything to get out. But the shepherd was faster, way faster. One moment, Daniel was running. The next, something crashed into him. He launched into the pavement hard, the Chihuahua sailing from his grasp. Pain shot through his ribs. His head spun. Then, the shepherd was on him. Daniel barely had time to register the presence until claws sank into his shoulder. Not enough to kill, just enough to pin him down, to hold him there, like a warning, like he were just some kind of game. Daniel wheezed, trying to get back into motion, but the shepherd hung far too heavy. This wasn't a fight. This was a message. And Daniel got a sense. It wasn't meant for him. It was supposed to be for the Chihuahua. The response they never saw coming. Daniel flinched from the weight on his shoulder. If you're gonna kill me, go ahead and kill me. The shepherd's lip curled. Then Daniel felt it. A shift, not in the air, in the Chihuahua. Daniel turned his head, and for the first time since hitting the ground, he saw it. The little dog was no longer limp. His body was tense, his breathing was steady, and his eyes, they were brighter than ever. Daniel didn't have much time to react before the Chihuahua stood, and in that moment, the entire street lit up. The power unleashed a burst of pure energy spread outwards, not like before, not controlled, not just a shockwave. This was something different, something worse. The shepherd's body seized, his claws retracted, and for a moment he took a step back. Daniel drew in a breath, the weight on his chest lifting, and then he realized something. Flying men in black were racing, not moving toward them, running away, because whatever was going on, they hadn't planned for it. The final moment. Daniel struggled to stand up. A Chihuahua was standing before him, but he wasn't just standing. His body was floating, not by much. A few inches off the ground, but still, he was not making contact with the pavement. Daniel's throat went dry. "Buddy?" The Chihuahua didn't so much as glance at him. He had locked onto the shepherd. And the shepherd, for the first time, he looked scared. The air thickened. The lights overhead hummed, humming heavy under the burden of something impossible. Then, the Chihuahua stepped forward once, and the world went white. They were running. The men in black, the ones who had tracked them all night, the ones who had made a monster out of a German shepherd, were running because something was wrong. The Chihuahua was experiencing something, and no one was ready for it. The sky burns. Daniel covered his eyes as the world around him exploded into white light. It wasn't just bright. It was blinding. The buildings, the streets, even the air itself felt charged with unnatural energy. Daniel could barely breathe. He didn't know if it was fear, awe, or something worse. But one thing was clear. The Chihuahua was no longer the same, not even close. The floating dog. Daniel struggled to avert his eyes. The little Chihuahua, once weak, frail, barely clinging to life, was levitating. Not hovering, levitating. His body hung in the air, his lithe frame fizzing with power, his fur standing up, and his eyes? No longer just glowing, they were burning, white-hot, like twin suns. Like he wasn't merely gawking anymore. He was seeing. Daniel's stomach twisted. "Buddy," he whispered. The Chihuahua didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even appear all there anymore, like he was somewhere else. And then the air changed. The final order. The German shepherd, still hunched a few feet away, stiffened. His ears flattened. His body shook, not from pain, from fear. He wasn't attacking for the first time. He was hesitating. Daniel's chest tightened. He knows he's not going to win. He knew. Then, one of the men in black snatched up a radio. Daniel barely heard the words over the ringing in his ears, but when he did, his blood turned to ice. "Initiate Protocol 0. The desperate response. As soon as the words were uttered, the shepherd took action. But not toward Daniel, not toward the Chihuahua, toward the men. Daniel's breath hitched. "Wait!" The shepherd lunged, faster than before, too fast. 1 second, he was still. The next, he had bitten into one of the men's throats. Daniel's stomach lurched. The man in black did not have time to scream before the shepherd tore him from his feet. Blood spattered the pavement. The other men reeled back. This wasn't part of the plan. This was not how it was supposed to go. They had lost control. And now, the German shepherd wasn't obeying orders anymore. The breakdown. The other agents panicked. One of them grabbed his gun. A mistake. The shepherd was on him, and before he could even aim. Daniel turned away. There was no saving them now. They had been so long in whomping up monsters. And now, the monsters they had created were turning on them. But Daniel hardly had time to consider that, because at that moment, the Chihuahua moved. The end begins. The white-hot light in the Chihuahua's eyes dimmed. His small body twitched. Then, a wave of energy radiated outwards. Not violent, not aggressive, just final, like a silent signal. And whatever it meant, the shepherd understood, because he stopped, turned, and for the first time since the war started, he lowered his head. Not out of submission, not out of fear, but out of recognition, as if the Chihuahua wasn't powerful. He was something greater. And then, the sky cracked open. The endgame Daniel's body locked up. He couldn't move, couldn't think. Not because the world was splitting up. A loud, rumbling sound reverberated in the air and shook the ground. Buildings rumbled, streetlights flickered, and then there came a shape descending from the sky. Not a ship, not a creature. Something else. Something Daniel didn't understand. His breath hitched because he realized it had never been about a dog. The Chihuahua he had never been merely an experiment. He had been a signal, a warning. And now, whatever he had waited for had finally arrived. Daniel felt it in his bones, the truth he had been fleeing from, the truth that the men in black had tried to conceal. The Chihuahua wasn't merely a runaway experiment. He was a signal, a warning. And now, what he had been waiting for had finally come. The heavens tore open above them, and Daniel knew there was no turning back. The sky falls, a low, thunderous rumble coursed through the air. Not a sound, not an explosion, something deeper, something alive. Daniel looked up, examining the broken sky. It wasn't just opening, it was tearing off as if the very fabric of reality was fraying. And beyond it, darkness, not empty space, not a void, something moving, something coming. Daniel's heart hammered inside his ribs. No, no, no! The Chihuahua floated higher, and then he spoke. The first and final words. It's time. The words weren't said aloud. They reverberated in Daniel's mind. Software final. Daniel froze. He had been trying to understand all this time, trying to save the Chihuahua, attempting to prevent what was going on. But now, he wanted to be in control, but he never was. The Chihuahua had not been awaiting rescue. He'd been waiting for this moment, for the sky to open, so the world can remember what it forgot. And now, it was too late. The shepherd kneels. Daniel hardly paid the German shepherd any mind. The horrible monster that a moment ago had been his enemy was now frozen and still. The scalding white light of his eyes faded. Then he lowered his head. A bow, not out of fear, but out of respect. Daniel's breath hitched. What are you? At last, the Chihuahua's searing gaze found his. The beginning. And then, the world broke. The memory awakens. It wasn't destruction, not fire, not war. It was a return. Daniel felt it in his soul, something pulling at him, something calling. His mind blurred, and suddenly, he remembered. The forbidden secret that humanity forgot flashes. Snippets of a world before this one, a world in which they'd been here before. Not the men in black, not the government, something older. That which had walked this earth before humans ever had a grasp on the idea of time. They had lived next door to them, watched them evolve, guided them. Then humans turned on them, and so they left, not destroyed, not defeated, dormant, waiting for when they might return. And the Chihuahua, the weak, tiny, fragile creature Daniel had put everything on the line to save? All along, he had been the key. Not a weapon, not a lost experiment, a messenger. And now, his message, it had been delivered. The final goodbye, Daniel's vision cleared. He was still standing, still breathing. The German shepherd was gone. The men in black, nowhere to be seen. And the Chihuahua, hovering a few feet in front of him. No longer glowing, no longer burning with power, just watching, like he was waiting for something. Daniel swallowed hard. What happens now? The Chihuahua blinked. Then he smiled, and in the blink of an eye, he was gone. Not faded, not teleported, just gone. And in his place, a single word, sunk onto the crumbling pavement beneath Daniel's feet. The word that hadn't been seen in centuries, a word to which humanity had tried to forget. But now, it was back. Return. And Daniel knew this was only the beginning.